next article is about community land trust, a tool that has proven to be effective in combating gentrification, unlocking housing affordability, and helping people in underserved communities who are discriminated by race and income. The article is a very interesting question. The idea of community land trust has been around since 1969. However, currently there are only a dozen of CLTs that are active in the space. To answer that question, you will hear a discussion about sustainable growth strategy for CLT and the various challenges these organizations face. Please welcome to the stage Annalise Palmer, MPP and JD Joint Degree student at the Harvard Kennedy School and Georgetown Law, and David Lubarov, Deputy Director at the Harvard Joint Center of Housing Studies.
Cool. Thank you so much, Dixie, and thank you, George. My name is Annalise. I'm a public policy and law student. And before I wanted to begin, I wanted to say thank you for the Joint Center for Housing Studies, which David is the deputy director of. This project came out of a Graham-Lick Fellowship, I guess, last year. And it was one of the best experiences of my time at the Kennedy School. So I wanted to thank you for their support of this research. And to begin, I'm going to do a really quick overview of what a community land trust is, and then we'll go into discussion. So community land trusts were originally, as Dixie said, came out in the late 1960s as a response to Black sharecroppers being forced off their land. And it was a way for these sharecroppers to pool their resources and gain control of the land. Now it has evolved as a land use model that will combat increasing affordability or it will preserve affordability in hot markets, and it also stabilizes housing in cold markets by reducing foreclosures. And lastly, if the community land trust model is done well, it would retain control of the land within the community through a nonprofit board. So very quickly, a simple overview of what a community land trust is the land trust itself is a nonprofit that holds land in perpetuity on behalf of the community. So its board is made up of community members. And the land trust will have ownership of the land underneath a home, and then through a long-term ground lease will give an individual ownership of the building itself on top of the land while retaining that control of the ground underneath it. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So then upon resale, the equity of the home is shared between the homeowner and the community through the community land trust. And then the community land trust will pass on its share of equity to the next homeowner in the form of a reduced price. And so in this way, the community land trust preserves affordability as long as they want to, and it takes sort of one subsidy or one initial land grant or gift to make a home affordable forever versus some other programs where you'll give a subsidy to the homeowner themselves, and then they'll take that subsidy with them on resale by having full equity of the home. And so next slide, I'll leave this up during the discussion. I'm not going to go into it now because you can read it, but my project looked at how there are, over 220 community land trusts in the country, but only a handful of them are really operating on a very significant scale. And sometimes that's on purpose, sometimes it's not. And so my project researched through interviews with 10 prominent community land trusts, what they did and why they were successful and what those strategies were that other community land trusts could emulate if they wanted to. And that's that, I'll leave it up for discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Annalise. So there are obviously many benefits that CLT model can bring. However, in your study, I remember you also point out there are two major criticisms that these organizations face. One being the administrative difficulties. Second being the CLT homeowners are often regarded as so-called second class. How do you and David respond to this criticism?
That's a wonderful question. I'll keep it brief and then David can respond. Wants to. I think these discussions about criticism really turn on what you see the goal of a CLT is, and looks at what policymakers, if they're thinking about giving subsidies or what their purpose is. And so the idea is I hope that's not my computer, sorry, is a complicated model, I think goes to whether or not you want the foremost concern to be community control of the land itself, or if you want it to be preserving affordability. If, say I'm city policymaker, I just want to preserve affordability, then maybe my better solution would be a deed restriction program, which is much more administratively simple. However, there isn't community control within the neighborhood. If you want robust community control in guiding the development, guiding, literally holding control of the land, then the CLT model would be better. And then additionally, the criticism that homeowners are second class because they're sharing their equity is a very valid one, and again goes to the goals of the program. If you want to preserve affordability permanently, then there is a trade-off that means within the CLT model that equity will be shared, and that's the function of, that's how it's able to be preserved in perpetuity. So if you want to help generations and generations of homeowners and preserve control of the land, there is that trade-off. However, if your goal is to build wealth for a much smaller group of people, which is an extremely valid goal, then that criticism is going to land a little bit more directly. What I do want to mention though is that CLT homeowners do build equity on their home. So it's not like it's, you're just getting free rent for however long. You're building equity. Homeowners in a 2011 study by Emily Thaden, they saw 22 to 39% return on investments of their home, which of course, is going to be more limited than if you had full equity, but you are still building wealth. And generally the homeowners in a community land trust would not have been able to access that equity otherwise. And that's, I think, an important consideration to keep in mind. And then additionally, you do have all the legal protections of being a homeowner. You can give your home to your children, it's inheritable. So it is, in that sense, you do have the sort of full protections of home ownership.
Let me just add, listening to this, first of all, Annalise, thank you for your kind words, because one of the best experiences of being deputy director of the Joint Center is getting to work with the Gramlich Fellows like you, really getting to do a deep dive into a set of really interesting questions and go along that journey with you, but having to send you ahead as the scouting party to do all the work. What strikes you in that question is it's this piece about real estate that we always wrestle with, which is, owning a house is both buying shelter and making an investment. And Annalise has really talked about that tension. But historically, in eras when house prices don't, might go up modestly, home ownership becomes a sort of interesting forced savings program. But in recent decades, we've also come to see it as a sort of speculative investment, and CLTs really force you to confront that choice, and I think, as Annalise said, make a decision that says we can deliver some of the benefits, but to make them sustainable, and since there's serious public dollars here, we might want to put restrictions. But it's been a hard conversation to have, and when you layer on that the administrative issues, it really speaks to the challenge of this really appealing idea that compared to other ways we build housing is still relatively modest, although there's clearly growing interest in it. I guess the last point is just as you look at some of the issues Annalise does a terrific job of highlighting, running a CLT is not, it's not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of work that goes into making these work, and I think a lot of folks get involved, and it may explain why a lot of CLTs stay small. That's just the pure administrative capacity and tracking is really important work, but it's not easy.
Yeah, Annalise, you also mentioned in your study there are 3 gestures for CLTs to grow. One being building support through public education and advocacy. 2 being outsourcing their non-essential businesses. 3 being trying to diversify their portfolio. So amongst all these gestures that you have mentioned, which one is most effective, do you think, to combat all the challenges?
Thanks for the question. I think in the interviews that I had with community land trust leaders, over and over again, I think developing local government support, and which in turn leads to a reduced reliance on philanthropy, I thought was effective. And all these these strategies really dovetail and complement each other. So it's kind of hard to, one will build on the other, of course. But that initial startup money that a lot of times a local government can support. So for example, in Burlington, the Land Trust is the biggest, one of the biggest in the countries. And they, when Bernie Sanders was mayor, he created a tax fund through property tax where 1% of all the property tax would go towards perpetual affordability through the Land Trust. And that really sparked this growth in the Land Trust. And additionally, it was incubated in the city offices for its first few years, which lowered the administrative burden. That said, I do want to highlight that incubating a Land Trust program within the city government sometimes undermines the idea that it's going to be totally controlled by the people who live on the land through the nonprofit board status. So again, it is this tension, and all these strategies come with these trade-offs. If you get really robust local government support, often that means you're going to be beholden to people outside of the community in a way that you wouldn't otherwise if you were able to sort of have this totally grassroots organization. That said, another really interesting land trust is the Dudley Co-op in Boston. And this organization was developed in the Dudley Triangle, and a big strategy that they said was very important is the government, or the local city government, gave them the power of eminent domain. And so that was a type of local support that really put the control back into the community while giving them this sort of financial boost in the beginning. And so I think, like we've been talking about, there are these trade-offs, but the support from local government seemed to be one of the biggest that the organization cited as helping initially get that subsidy, which then they could recycle and recycle over again and rely less on grants in the future.
All right, thank you very much.